the other part of your question was again?
This is more the impact side, if you're starting to
Yes.
see policy action in Australia.
Yes, we are, and that's really fascinating because that cannot be avoided. There are a couple areas in particular. I think the most striking one is sea level rise. Now, you may think, why that? Because it's such a slow process according to human time frames. But in fact, if you look at the combination of a modest sea level rise, I'm only talking about 20 or 30 centimeters, and a storm surge and a high tide, a 1 in a 100-year flood starts happening every few years. And if you go up to a half a meter sea level rise, a 1 in a 100-year flood in some areas of Australia happens several times a year. This is serious, and it's happening now. We already see the increase in inundation. What does this mean? We're talking about different types of adaptation. Some areas you can harden. You can put in seawalls. Other areas you can't because of the topography. Do we have a planned retreat? All right, that sounds nice, but already there are lawsuits. People who have expensive properties, wealthy people on the coast, are suing. They're suing local councils for allowing them to build there. Well, the local councils say, well, you muscled in and messed up the zoning laws so that you could live there. So we have enormous legal tangles already. This isn't 2050. This is 2010. I go to meetings now on sea level rise. There are very few of us scientists. It's dominated by lawyers and local council people. But this is where the rubber hits the road. It's happening in water. We're trying to put a price on water now and use a water market to sort out what's happening in our biggest catchment, the Murray-Darling Basin. The fight over that now, because irrigators' rights are being bought back by the government for environmental flows, that's as big a political outcry as the climate issue. So the rubber is really hitting the road in many ways, and these are climate-related. So if you like, in a way, this continent is acting as the canary in the coal mine as to what actually is going to happen as some of these impacts ramp up.
Thanks, Will. So David, we also had a chat before this panel, and we were discussing how to respond to impacts, and you suggested something very intriguing in my mind, which is that we're having so enormous challenges on acting on mitigation, very much based on the arguments that you're making, Jim, that we're so addicted to fossil fuels, and as long as we don't get the price right, we're going to burn up the fossil fuels we had. And you suggested that perhaps a key way forward is investment in adaptation, and that adaptation, in fact, opens up a window of opportunity. Would you like to develop that a bit?
Sure, thanks very much, Johan. Yes, I think there's no doubt that we've been talking a great deal in many fora about the need for low-carbon economies, for greening our activities, and much of this is to do with really pushing down our consumption and requirements for a carbon economy. Now, we can't stop doing that, but at the same time, there is no doubt, as we've all talked about in this meeting so far, that we are going to experience a warmer, changed world as we go forward. At a meeting yesterday, we were talking about cities in 50 years' time, because buildings and infrastructure is being constructed for half a century ahead. Well, yeah, low carbon systems in those buildings, but are these buildings being built to adapt to a warmer climate, a climate that may be more stormy? We may have more precipitation, we may have less precipitation. We will certainly have a changed set of circumstances. So we need to think about adapting ourselves certainly for the next several decades, as well as building in all of these carbon issues. And that brings you on to the area of, well, if we're going to change and have to adapt to these new circumstances, what is the driver of change? What's the driver to get us greener, to reduce our emissions, and to enable us to adapt to live lives in the future? Well, in my view, the greatest forces are the media and business. Governments can do so much. They're usually somewhat negative. Governments can tax. We've already heard, actually, Johan, you were talking about Sweden. And that was very successful and is continuing to be successful. But we're talking about a small population that's well educated and quite sophisticated and has had a long track record of working with the environment. for the rest of the world, the challenge is much greater. And therefore, we view governments in a negative way because they tax. They also legislate, and we don't like legislation as much either. It constrains the boundaries of individual rights and individual activity. The media are another force, but we think about them in a rather contrary way. We're either force-fed particular views or it's to sell newspapers. But we are all consumers. Every one of us consumes everyday products and services. And it's amazing how fashions can change, because we are, as consumers, dictated to by business, commerce, industry that has particular products. And we can imagine, and we know, that fashion changes overnight. We have to harness business as the greatest way to change consumer patterns, in my view, in the coming years. And it has to be helped by government, and it has to be helped by the media. But as consumers, we can be changed, not that we may know it unwittingly, by the pattern in which business operates. But business has to embrace the mores of a low-carbon economy, and we have to help them to move in that direction. But there's no doubt in my mind that if business can make money out of new products and processes and services which are green and low carbon and help us to adapt to the future, we can change much more quickly than the slow, rather laborious methods that are typically employed by governments in many countries around the world.
Mm. Thanks, David. Just as Andy Lipkis, who's sitting here from Tree People, reminded me just after the morning that in fact that was also what happened with the Montreal Protocol, that consumer pressure helped the whole protocol in order to change the face of the industry, because industry started to realize that consumers were walking in a new direction. So of course the combination of regulation and consumer behaviors is very powerful indeed. I'd like to open the floor now for questions. We have a quarter of an hour, and I very much appreciate if you could present yourself very briefly and pose questions, not make large comments, but questions directly to the panel. I would be very glad if you could do that. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Isabel Hilton. I work for China Dialogue. My question's on glaciers, and thank you very much for your presentation on the ice situation at the North and the South Poles. In this part of the world, we're more concerned directly with the third pole, the glaciers of the Himalaya, which are exhibiting some variability, as you suggested, with the Karakoram growing, but the rest largely in retreat. But apart from weather variability, there does seem to be another important factor here, which is altitude. And I just wondered if there had been any modeling work under various scenarios as to where the zero isotherm line might move to, thinking of the impact that has on the glacier-dependent rivers of Asia. Do you know of such work, and does it tell us anything useful under various temperature scenarios about the eventual fate of the high-altitude glaciers?
David.
Yes, what you're describing is where both the snow line falls, but also the equilibrium line. The equilibrium line is the line where the snow that falls in the winter melts in the summer, and below it the ice is losing mass all the time, and above it it's gaining mass. And what we've seen is that the equilibrium line is very sensitive to temperature and regional circumstances, the micro meteorology, but by and large, the equilibrium line is moving in a way in which we are seeing much less snow remaining during the year. So the equilibrium line is moving up the glacier, the area of ablation, of loss is increasing. But I do emphasize again, you can make generalizations around the world and you can produce these lines. I mean, there's a classic one that goes all the way from Alaska down through the Rockies and then down into the Andes, and you can see where the equilibrium line is and how it is shifting. But much of what is happening for people locally is whether, quote, their glacier or set of glaciers is doing something, and that's very much to do with local circumstances, and you can get increase in precipitation which will override, as I indicated, the temperature trends. So, and also over time, you can get some certain instabilities. If the ice is very close to the melting point at the bed, you can sometimes get surges, which apparently are advancing glaciers, but is actually an internal mechanism and not necessarily driven by climate. So I think glaciers are hugely important. And I would just say that they're important because they are a source of water and stream flow for many communities. We saw in one of the pictures Kilimanjaro with the snows on the top. Hemingway wrote about the snows of Kilimanjaro. I have a talk called Hemingway's Lament, because there will be no snows on the top of Kilimanjaro because the equilibrium line is now above the top of the mountain. And the ice that is there is unsustainable, and we will see it disappear probably within a couple of decades. And that is actually important, in part for the communities that lie around mountains like that, where stream flow at certain times of the year is important. It's not the only issue, but it is important for how communities survive.
Thank you. Fantastic. We've even squeezed in an advanced lecture on glaciology into our panel. That's amazing. Thanks, David. Next question, please.